Welcome to Bene Naras, where we discuss all things Latin and writing and books, and my dog has a lot of opinions.
So my name is Rachel Clenning, and yes, cats chase away mountain deer from my house.
I am Arianne Carroll, and I have a dog who is currently doing her best to get in as much trouble as possible, but is also really kind of exemplifying why action verbs are perhaps more compelling than when she just sits on the floor.
Let's hope that, in fact, people do find our action verbs like chasing deer away and barking incessantly more compelling than solids.
I find it more compelling when she sits on the floor. But that's our story today. And the dog is helping, and the deer are helping, and the cats are helping. We're going to talk about action verbs and why they help making stories more compelling.
So let's get started with that. Action verbs show action and they help to create mental imagery. You probably can imagine my cat running to a window and chasing a buck away, just like you can imagine a dog running around and barking.
At the road.
So action verbs are important in reading in any language and having rich and compelling dialogues in any language. And I feel like they're even more so important in a non-native language because you need to really work a little bit harder to get your reader.
Yeah, they help create imagery. And that's important in any language, and even more so in a language where you're already going to be struggling a little bit more to create that mental picture. So some verbs are really high value verbs. And they help you do that with a lot less effort than like est. Effugera, super high value verb. People fleeing is way more interesting than just like going. Jacera, hetera, sequi, trahera, tollera, all of those have like a sense about them and movement about them and connotation about them. And they're all words that I've found use for in both writing lower level and upper level work. It's super possible to use illustrative vocabulary at a lower level, and all of those are high frequency words. Dragging something, way more interesting than capit et it, and lifting the knife is far more interesting than habetting the knife. Obviously, there will be times when you write capit et it. Are you Calare,
sorry, you were
like
lifting
Rachel
the knife, and I was like, I have to go away. She's got the knife.
Rachel say kalat, way more interesting than like she doesn't like it. And there are going to be times when you write capit et it. There just are. No one's going to tell you it's against like the writing laws to do that. We are working in a space where vocab is limited, and it's going to happen. So don't feel like we're sitting here like flagellating you for having to write simply sometimes.
Yeah,
that's real.
I write like that quite frequently. People frequently have things. I've honestly even never written with the word like lift. So no one has ever lifted a knife in my books, regrettably. Now I want to do that though. But at the same time, it is so hard when you're writing with limited vocabulary to get enough repetitions in with some of those dynamic verbs. You have to find the dynamic words and the compelling words that fit with the story you are trying to tell.
Good way to get yourself started if you want. Sit down with the Dickinson College Commentaries list or any other list that makes you feel the most jolly. If you're using the DCC, set it to give you verbs, and Rachel showed us how to do that in episode 8, part 1, if you don't know how. And look at, say, 20 verbs, and imagine what each of those verbs looks like to you and feels like to you. What do those make you imagine? And make note of which ones feel dynamic and which ones don't. And then aim to include a high percentage of dynamic verbs in your writing. Lucia spends a lot of time dragging a sword around, which gives you an idea of how big the sword is and how big she's not. Picture your story.
Yes, and I love that suggestion because once I really started to think about the story I'm going to write and I have an idea of where I want to go, I do in fact sit down with the DCC. I don't necessarily limit it to just verbs, but I go through everything and I jot down words that I think are going to be important to my story, both for telling it and for making it more vivid and for ensuring that I'm using high frequency vocab that's on that topic. Yeah, and using really rich and descriptive language, it strengthens your story, and it can strengthen and like increase the tension, and it can evoke emotions in your reader, which are things that you really want to do, mostly because it also helps improve the comprehension if you're really getting at your reader like that.
Exactly. If you can make people feel things, they will be far more capable of understanding what's going on. I want to go in a completely different direction for a moment, now that we've said that. And talk for a minute about a couple of words that aren't action words, just to draw a contrast for people who are watching. Non-action verbs might be things like dikera and esse and habira. Can you think of a couple? Do you have any others?
Well, wella
Yeah.
and widera. Widera is one we've already talked about, but those two would be ones that are super useful.
But aren't action verbs.
Yeah.
So, and all of those are really important verbs. They establish concrete behavior, they establish motivation, they help with characterization, they help to draw a picture. Neither of us is advocating not using them. Do not sit here and think we're saying, don't use est. But they don't move the plot.
That's not possible.
You know what? I'm actually now going to challenge myself to do that. They don't move the plot. They don't suggest motion, and they don't help your imagination wander. They're useful, but they're static. So they're going to keep your story in one place. So you can't rely solely on them.
Right. And just in case we're not being crystal clear enough, we use these verbs all the time. I've used all of them in every novella I have ever written.
156 repetitions.
So many repetitions.
Yeah.
But we don't only use them.
Right.
I love having characters like clamate their responses when they get worked up or when they're shouting about something. It's never just deke it. Even though that means that I'm using more vocabulary, it gives me something more than says, which is kind of important.
And sometimes it's a really worthwhile trade-off. If it takes a few more words to keep somebody interested in reading, I'm going to use the few more words. And if you don't have the verbs, I realize we're talking about verbs today. If you don't have the verbs though, throw in an adverb to how somebody responds or does something. It helps us imagine how a character is speaking or behaving. I want to mention briefly two other words that I highly recommend and have really gotten more into using fairly recently, koipise and konari, which are not your traditional action verbs because they don't move, but they're useful because they allow for a sense of progress or process, which is sort of internal movement. And we can imagine the idea of like starting to do something or trying to do something that gives us that sort of imaginative aspect.
But I also just want to say, yo, they're both on the DCC.
Something's on the DCC, Rachel approves. And when we use action verbs, you used that word tension. When we use action verbs, we start to create tension. And tension is such an important part of making a story come to life. If there's never a moment of breath holding or wanting to know what happens next, you don't read. So imagine, here's Kailia, here's my taberna. Kailia tabernam videt. Cool, whatever. Versus Kailia lente ad tabernam se vertit. You give me a face. I use.
Well, it's because the voice. I was not expecting the voice. I mean,
it's my drama voice. I use Widera
like
all the time. Thank you. I use Widera all the time. I can't write without it. We've mentioned that. But that second sentence has a sense of life and a sense of purpose. Why is she turning toward the taberna? What's going to happen when she sees it? What does it look like? What's there? There's anticipation that doesn't exist when she just like tabernam videt. Kailia tabernam videt is a little bit flatter.
So much like you are visually seeing us be silly and you're inferring a lot of things about who we are as people. Yeah, like, I don't know. You really want your readers to imagine and start making inferences about characters and to really connect with them. And action and dynamic verbs are some of the ways that you can do that.
Yeah.
So you can pick some verbs that really work for your story that are compelling. But sometimes you really do come to that line where you think, I will never get enough repetitions of this word. Is it worth it to gloss it? And I have to say, I went back and forth on whether to gloss Hyans and Pegasus and Bellerophon because I wanted it to create that immediate tension where Pegasus is literally looking into the flaming mouth of the chimera. And gaping gave me such a more powerful punch, even though I only used it like 4 or 5 times, which is not enough. So I 3 times. No, I used it 4 times.
Was it one of that? Okay,
4.
well, I believe you wrote it.
I'm pretty sure there's 4.
We'll compromise
anyway,
on 4.
4 times, which is still nowhere near enough. And I glossed it every single time, but I felt like it gave it a more emotional punch and more fear and more immediacy. So for me, it ended up being worth it. But I got to tell you, I agonized over whether to use that word.
Well, and you really do weigh each one. You know, at some point you can say to yourself, oh, but I could really use depilare, which means, by the way, to take out all the feathers or the hair off of something. Don't use that. I mean, totally do. But, you know, you think I could really use this. This would make the scene more beautiful. And you say that with, 19 different words. At some point you have to say to yourself, okay, something has to be simplified. So you weigh each one. And Hyans is a really beautiful example of that because you're exactly right. There's fear there. It tells us more than just what the chimera looks like. It also tells us, how is Pegasus feeling? How is Bellerophon feeling? If you're looking down into a gaping flame mouth instead of just face, that makes a huge difference in the way that the scene plays out. And so you have to ask yourself, like, what's the potential impact of this word? And do I really, really want it? And if you do, cool, gloss it. Also, do you have too many glosses in that chapter? Because if you do, figure that out. Work that one out. We're going to wrap up for the moment. We know we promised you both action verbs and concrete nouns, but I'm going to do an action verb and yeet the concrete nouns. I was taught the word yeet. I know yeet now. It means like throw, I think. I don't know. If you know what yeet means, you should send us an email.
I was just going to use the action verb of like cutting off, like I'm just going to chop that sucker off.
Yeet.
We're going
to yeet the concrete nouns into our next episode. Please do email us with your best definition of yeet and any other questions that you might have. Or topics that you
know, but can you remind, it's benenaraslatine@gmail.com?
I think that's what it is, yeah.
But we really just want to emphasize that each story has its own unique vocabulary beyond common ones that are found in almost every single novellas, like Wolo, Habeo. And it's these unique words that tell your story and create your tension. So you need to find your words and make your story sparkle for your reader.
It's exactly true. And I'm going to say something that's less beautiful than that, but also important. Your vocab is limited. So try to choose really rich vocab and try to choose vocab that's going to do a lot of heavy lifting for you. Depilare is great. It draws a picture. I want to find a reason to use it, but it isn't going to do a whole lot of work for me. You can yakera a lot. You can petera a lot. There are many things you can trahera. If you are depilareing a whole lot of things, please email us about that too.
It is like past time for us to wrap up. We've been very silly today. Next time, we will talk about concrete nouns, and we may or may not be as silly as we are right now.
We'll see. Until then, scrivite bonis avibus, perhaps with your goggles on, and facite valiantes.